All right, welcome everyone. This is the second in our series on nuclear weapons and international law. My name is Professor Jeff Biller. I'm an associate professor of law here at the Air Force Academy. And we started this series kind of in conjunction with an annual symposium that we now do. We co-host together with the New York State Bar Association and a number of other organizations. We're going to be hosting that again in January. At the end of this webinar, I'll be posting some links to that. So if you're interested in this topic or the topic of nuclear weapons and international law generally, then you'll have that information. But for now, we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. And for that, I'd like to introduce Major Brian Green. Major Green has served in the United States Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps since 2005. His duties have focused for more than a decade on space, operations, and international law. He holds Bachelor of Arts degrees in political science and interdisciplinary visual arts from the University of Washington, which happens to be my alma mater as well, a Juris Doctor from the University of Virginia, and a Master of Laws in Air and Space Law from McGill University. And as with all of our webinars, the opinions expressed in this webinar are not any of the panelists and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Air Force, or any of their components or members. All right, and so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Major Green, and you should be good to go if you want to share your slides at any point, Major Green.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Biller, and go Huskies.
That's right.
I will go ahead and start sharing my presentation. How does that work for everybody?
That looks fantastic.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide. My topic for today is about countering space-based weapons of mass destruction. And this is an issue that has really come to the attention of the world since February of this year, when Congressman Mike Turner made a somewhat cryptic revelation that there is a potential threat, national security issue that should be declassified, that the American people should know about. And it quickly emerged after that there was some kind of a Russian space-based nuclear weapon program that he was referring to, and that this was certainly and justifiably of big concern to the United States. So I had been working on an article dealing with threats of this nature, just given the increasing international tensions, given Russian and other countries' sometimes non-compliance with international law, recognizing that Russia had already violated in various ways most of the other arms control treaties that they had been party to. And although for many years it seemed that the Outer Space Treaty itself and its ban on the stationing of nuclear weapons in space was inviolable, there were troubling signs that Russia might have been preparing to violate even that as well. And so I wrote an article, took several months to get cleared for publication, but I'm glad that that happened, and that I'm relying on that for being able to conduct this presentation with you today. And there have also been a variety of other public articles and official pronouncements and things in the past several months that have led to more details, including a recent New York Times article that just came out last week that provides some more details that I will be referring to here as well. Although can't necessarily confirm or deny everything that's reported in public sources, but that is out there if people are interested in looking at it. So to go over the basic topics for this this webinar, and if my slides will advance here. Let's see. Give me a moment. Okay, there we go. All right, so I'd like to provide a little bit of space nuclear history and the practical and legal background to the current situation that we find ourselves in, as well as an overview of some emerging threats, not only from Russia, but also looking at some potential capabilities that China has demonstrated, and that might be available to other countries as well. And then look at a legal framework for figuring out how do we respond to these, recognizing where certain activities are illegal and or would be illegal, and where we might need to use our various instruments of national power and our various legal mechanisms to respond to and hopefully deter and, if necessary, defeat any of these threats. All right, so space nuclear history goes back to very close to the start of the space age, and in fact, concerned about the possibility that the Soviets would attempt to, whether through ballistic missiles or through space-based anti-satellite weapons or nuclear bombardment systems for the Earth, the United States was interested in figuring out how could we defeat a Soviet threat early in the Cold War. And so some of the things that we tried doing were conducting a series of high altitude and ultimately including exoatmospheric nuclear tests back in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The most powerful nuclear device that the United States detonated was conducted in the Starfish Prime test, 9 July 1962. And this was an event that had a 1.4 megaton yield. We did it over the South Pacific, and it had some significant effects, certainly well beyond what the scientists who were in charge of it were expecting. It caused artificial auroras to appear in the sky, and it even caused power outages, triggered car alarms, had a variety of effects that were observable 1,000 miles away over in Hawaii. And so it definitely demonstrated that nuclear detonation in space could have some significant effects, even detectable on Earth. In addition to that, looking at the space environment in particular, this event contributed to the creation of artificial radiation belts. So the Earth has some naturally occurring belts of radiation aligned with its magnetic poles, known as the Van Allen belts. And there's an inner one and an outer one. They're kind of donut shaped. The picture on the lower left that you see there is kind of a cross section illustrating their rough proportions in relation to the Earth. And these natural radiation belts do a lot of good for Earth in protecting us from solar radiation, trapping a lot of energetic particles that are coming from the sun, and really making sure that we have the optimal environment here on Earth. But if you detonate a nuclear weapon in orbit or a nuclear device in orbit, then it can supercharge those, as well as creating artificial radiation belts that are perhaps not so helpful. And in fact, what we saw from the Starfish Prime test, as well as the USSR's Project Ka test that happened over Kazakhstan just a few months later during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that particular test ended up just frying and shorting out hundreds of miles of power lines and telephone lines, completely disabled a power station down there. And this even had effects on buried cables that they had set up to monitor, try to have some safety mechanisms against overloading, but those were all blown through by the electromagnetic pulse generated by this test. And then getting back to the issues on orbit, between the Starfish Prime test and Project Ka detonations, these artificial radiation belts and the increase in radiation generated in orbit basically is judged to have prematurely disabled roughly a third of the satellites then in orbit, roughly 7 or 8 of the about 24 satellites that existed at the time, including Telstar 1, the very first commercial communication satellite, joint project of the US and Canada that launched the day after Starfish Prime, and Ariel 1, the United Kingdom's very first satellite. So these tests had a deleterious impact on the safe and peaceful use of space for all nations. And let's remember that this is still a number of years before the Outer Space Treaty. In addition to these detonation tests, the United States and the Soviet Union also had programs running for a while that would use direct ascent nuclear missiles to potentially fly up in space and detonate there to basically attack and disable nuclear weapons that they thought the other country might be sending in on orbit or on ballistic trajectories. And so, these existed, but they didn't involve actually stationing a nuclear weapon in orbit. The Starfish Prime and Soviet tests were also done with direct ascent missile detonations. But learning about the harmful effects generated by these tests really provided an impetus, in addition to the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, for President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev to ultimately negotiate and agree to the first serious nuclear arms control treaty, the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963. And this treaty does just what it says in the title. It says that the states parties, which include a variety of other countries besides the US and Soviet Union or Russia, but basically it limits any nuclear detonation tests other than ones that are happening underground and that are not expected to cause any harmful radiation or other effects outside the state that is doing it, or the territory subject to their jurisdiction. And it specifically says that states are banned from conducting nuclear detonation tests in outer space. It wasn't just the ones in outer space, but in the air, underwater. We realized these things are very dangerous, and it'll be better for the whole world if we can just refrain from doing them. And so the Limited Test Ban Treaty has caught on. It is pretty widely subscribed, although not by all nuclear powers, unfortunately. But even those countries that are not party to it have basically restricted their nuclear detonation testing to underground or simply refrain from doing it. France continued to test things underwater for a while, but they stopped doing that as well. So the Limited Test Ban Treaty was a very important first step in saying, hey, we need to legally prevent ourselves from doing this. The Limited Test Ban Treaty was also done without prejudice to the establishment of a more comprehensive test ban treaty. And there is, in fact, a comprehensive test ban treaty that is out there, but it has not gone into effect yet because the United States and Russia and various other countries are not party to it. I'm going to move on now to the Outer Space Treaty, and this happened just 4 years after the Limited Test Ban Treaty went into effect. And it tries to build on the Limited Test Ban Treaty in a variety of ways. First of all, it also refers back to a UN General Assembly resolution that was passed shortly after the Limited Test Ban Treaty that not only said that states should not conduct nuclear detonations in space, but also that they should not be placed in orbit or installed on celestial bodies. And as a UN General Assembly resolution, that was a non-binding instrument, but it certainly set a good signal for where the world was headed. And ultimately, this became a matter of binding law for parties to the Outer Space Treaty, which included the Soviet Union at the time. Russia has acceded to that, and China as well. And in Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, it states that states parties undertake not to place in orbit around the Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, install such weapons on celestial bodies, or station such weapons in outer space in any other manner. So we have a very clear ban on stationing nuclear weapons or other WMD in outer space. And although weapons of mass destruction are not specifically defined in the treaty, that term has generally been understood, and you can see it in other international instruments, other domestic laws, to include this chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapon set of capabilities because of the ways that these things are so potentially widely destructive. And so, for many years, it was pretty clear that countries were abiding by that. And yet, it looks like there are some challenges to that. I say that with the caveat that there were some early attempts by the Soviet Union, within a year of the Outer Space Treaty going into effect, that they wanted to make clear, it seemed, that they were taking a very narrow view of this idea of stationing weapons in outer space, because the Soviet Union back in the late 1960s was already working on a so-called fractional orbital bombardment system, wherein they could loft a missile with a potentially nuclear payload into Earth orbit, but not actually complete a full orbit, but rather drop it out of orbit at a time and direction of their choosing, in order potentially to circumvent some of our ballistic missile early warning systems, and basically make it easier for their weapons to get through if they saw a need to do that. Now, fortunately, they only tested this ever with non-nuclear payloads on board, but when the U.S. found out about it, Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara, assessed that doing a partial orbit wouldn't necessarily be stationing it in orbit. And so it didn't absolutely violate the text of the treaty. And so that's kind of the overall position that seems to have reached consensus since that time. And we'll talk about that with regard to some more recent developments in China. There are some other provisions in the Outer Space Treaty that are relevant as well to the deployment of potential nuclear devices in outer space. And a lot of these are found in Article 9, which recognizes that in all of their activities in the exploration and use of outer space, states should be guided by the principle of cooperation and mutual assistance, that they should exercise due regard for the corresponding interests of other states in their activities in the exploration and use of outer space, and that if a state believes its planned activity or experiment in outer space would cause potentially harmful interference with the peaceful space activities of any other state party, then it shall engage in international consultations to ameliorate that risk. Similarly, if any state party believes that another state's activities would cause potentially harmful interference with its own, then it has the right to seek consultations there. And so all of these things could potentially be relevant in relation to the wrongfulness of placement of a nuclear weapon in outer space. Obviously, if a state is doing this unilaterally, it tends to work to the detriment of all countries that could be operating in space. It shows a lack of due regard, I would argue, and certainly presents a very real threat of harmful interference. And so the consultation requirement is something that I think we need to have a look at, because it's something that countries have not really engaged in any formal sense since the treaty went into effect. Largely, countries have been self-policing in this area and have been responsible for determining how safe their own activities are, and basically making the argument that whatever they're doing is consistent with the Outer Space Treaty. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that most of the text of Article 9 was actually proposed by the Soviet delegate to the writing conference for the Outer Space Treaty, in response to some U.S. scientific experiments that some astronomers objected to because of the way they left certain clumps of little copper dipoles, little needles in outer space for a time. And so the Soviet Union was the country itself that put a lot of this language in place about the importance of due regard and consultations. And Russia is certainly heir to that heritage as well, and subject to all of these obligations. The provisions against contaminating the outer space environment or the Earth's environment could also come into play, given the possibility of long-term radiation damage from a nuclear detonation in orbit, certainly. In addition to the Limited Test Ban Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty, there are other treaties that may also be implicated by the work on a nuclear weapons program in space. And currently, the United States and Russia are still both subject to the what we call the New START Treaty for short, a New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. You see the full title on the slide there. And basically, this is the successor to a variety of agreements that were reached during the Cold War, in which the United States and the Soviet Union, later the Russian Federation, agreed that we should have certain caps on the number of nuclear weapons that we had, as well as of the delivery systems for those, such as intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, sea-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, as well as the launchers and heavy bombers that could deliver them. And some of the things that this treaty and its protocol do are that they give the parties the right to assess each other's compliance with the treaty, including through direct inspections by people going over to the other country and taking a look around their facilities and military capabilities and so forth, as well as continuing to have access to their national technical means of verification, which could include a variety of things, but historically it's been kind of a euphemism or term of art that has been understood to include intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance satellites. Even back in the era when the existence of those things was a state secret. And so the countries pledged not to interfere with those or to try to hide things from satellite observation, so we can be more confident that the other party is actually complying. And unfortunately, as we will see, Russia has not been fully compliant with that in the past few years. The treaty also establishes a bilateral consultative committee and kind of a regular schedule of communications to try to reduce any improper threat perception. But as we are recognizing that, okay, that there are these legal mechanisms in place, and a nuclear weapon in outer space, maybe it's not specifically discussed here because we already agreed it was illegal under the Outer Space Treaty, but if a country were to detonate a nuclear weapon in space, it could certainly have a significant bad impact on any space-based national technical means of treaty verification, as well as the other harms that it would cause. All right, so now we get to the Russian nuclear ASAP program that has been of such big concern lately. And this is there is a current Pathfinder kind of satellite that Russia launched in February 22. Interestingly, just shortly before its major full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And this is something that was revealed this year as something that, as you can see, the then Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, John Plum, stated that that they're developing a concerning anti-satellite capability related to a new satellite carrying a nuclear device that Russia is developing. This capability could pose a threat to all satellites, as well as their vital services. And as General Stephen Whiting, the commander of U.S. Space Command, stated in July of this year, if they were to use this kind of orbital nuclear weapon, it would be completely indiscriminate and hold at risk the entire modern way of life, not just for the United States, but for China, for Japan, for France, for all the countries that use and rely on space. And we've got over 90 spacefaring countries now that have some kind of capability in orbit that could potentially be affected by a nuclear blast in orbit. And as far as we're able to tell, to this date, the capability that they currently have in orbit is not a live nuclear device, but basically a way of testing things out so they could get ready to do one or more in the future. And some issues of particular concern with this are that it is at a pretty high altitude. And so it would basically be somewhere near the outer limits of low Earth orbit, around the area where those lower Van Allen radiation belts start. And so from that altitude, it could potentially pose an immediate and long-term threat, if armed, to basically all satellites in low Earth orbit, where anything in the immediate blast zone could be almost instantly disabled. And then over time, there could be some significant radiation effects that would degrade components on other satellites that are continuing to orbit around the Earth and passing through the radiation field and the increased radiation belts generated by this. Also being up there in or adjacent to the Van Allen belt, it could have some significant effects, just as we saw with the earlier Soviet testing. And even beyond LEO, there is a concern significantly for satellites that are out beyond low Earth orbit because of the way that the radiation and the effects could travel through the vacuum of space to potentially affect even satellites in medium Earth orbit, such as GPS, or out in geosynchronous orbit, which include a lot of our highest value military and civilian satellites for all nations. Now, satellites that are built further out beyond the Van Allen belts, do have to be built to cope with an increased dosage of solar radiation. And so they might be, in general, more hardened than satellites in LEO have to be against radiation effects, but they could still be affected. And if you think about the brightness of a nuclear blast and how that could potentially affect optical sensors or other things, in addition to shorting out electrical circuits, overloading solar panels, there are a lot of ways in which a nuclear detonation in space could adversely affect satellites, as well as potentially causing electromagnetic pulse effects on Earth, depending on how things work out. And so there's a lot of danger to it. Here are some additional images from the New York Times article that came out recently, hypothesizing how the radiation would spread out around the Earth. And you can see that that really there would be a wide-ranging area of effects. And then if you think not only about the primary effects of a nuclear blast in space, but also the secondary effects. For a long time, we've been concerned about the so-called Kessler cascade that could happen if satellites are disabled, if they collide into each other in orbit, cause fragments that run into other satellites, and exponentially increase the risk of collisions with space debris, potentially to the point where an orbit or orbital regime could become unusable for a significant period of time. And a nuclear detonation in orbit could really exacerbate that possibility. Back in the early 1960s, when these kinds of capabilities were first being tested out before they became illegal, it already became clear that a third of satellites within a year or so were already disabled as a result of this. And there were only a handful of satellites that existed in orbit at the time. Now we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of satellites. We've got mega constellations such as Starlink and OneWeb. China is working on mega constellations as well, so they would be significantly affected by any event of this type. And if you look at this chart here in the background, also taken from the recent New York Times article, you can start to see the amount of reliance that different countries have on space based on the number of objects that they have launched into orbit. And with the deployment of these large constellations, compare that red part of the graph representing US objects launched into space with what we see from other countries. Russia used to be the leader, as you can see from the early years of the slide. They had the first object in orbit, Sputnik. And yet they have declined over time to the point where maybe Russia is thinking that if they were to detonate a nuclear weapon in orbit, and even if that would mean knocking out a significant proportion of their own satellites, endangering the lives of their cosmonauts on board the International Space Station if they were still there at the time, as well as any other astronauts in low Earth orbit, such as on the Chinese space station, or anybody who might be transiting from Earth to the space station. Maybe he could just do more harm to other countries than the harm he would be inflicting on himself and on Russia. And so that gives us some real cause for concern. You also see on this slide a roundup. This is a non-complete list, non-exclusive list of some significant Russian treaty violations in recent years. Many of them related to the conflict in Ukraine, but also just as more general issues. The US Department of State puts out a report every year on how countries are doing at complying with different kinds of significant arms control treaties. And they routinely mention that Russia is likely continuing to conduct research and potentially use and deployment of a variety of prohibited weapons, including chemical and biological weapons. We've seen that obviously they have just blown through things like the Budapest Agreement, in which they agreed to respect Ukrainian sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine returning Soviet nuclear weapons to Russia at the end of the Cold War. They have been conducting many attacks, routine attacks, almost daily attacks on civilians with no military purpose other than inflicting fear and terror and pain on the civilian populace of Ukraine in the past 2.5 years. And over the years, we've also seen them violating their obligations under the bilateral Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with the United States and the Open Skies Treaty, some additional arms control treaties that provided a measure of stability during and for a time after the Cold War, but they basically stopped complying with those. And we've seen just recently a demonstration of some of the fruits of that with their firing of the Oreshnik intermediate range ballistic missile at Ukraine in alleged retaliation for the US and other countries agreeing to allow Ukraine to conduct some longer range strikes with donated weapons or weapons that we've sold them into Russia. We talked about New START a little bit already. And for the past couple of years, Russia has been denying US inspectors access to their nuclear sites and refusing to send information as required under the treaty. And so the United States has started to engage in some reciprocal countermeasures for that, which we'll discuss in a little more detail. And then I think fundamentally, and the most important and serious violation of international law that Russia has committed, although they vetoed the Security Council resolution that would condemn them for it, is the absolute violation of the UN Charter's ban on the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other UN member state with regard to their unlawful invasion of Ukraine in really first going back to 2014, but then in a much more destructive way beginning in February of 2022. And so for all these reasons, it is not necessarily surprising that Russia has seen fit to go ahead and start making preparations at minimum to violate the Outer Space Treaty's ban on stationing a nuclear weapon in orbit. But it's not just Russia that should be of concern. China has also demonstrated some potentially dangerous ways to threaten us with nuclear weapons launched into a fractional orbit, but that could potentially, if they desire, be placed into a recurring orbit. It really just depends on what they do with the launch trajectory. And then one thing that China has done, they demonstrated this a few years ago, is they've mated a hypersonic glide vehicle to their ballistic missile so that they could potentially maneuver the glide vehicle into and within the atmosphere in a less predictable way than you might have with a traditional ballistic missile or even independently retargetable reentry vehicles from a ballistic missile. And again, provide more of a challenge to overcome with our missile tracking and defenses. And so even though the United States position since the Cold War has been that, well, FOBs don't necessarily violate the Outer Space Treaty explicitly, there's a very fine line. And if something goes beyond a single revolution in orbit, then that could very likely be considered to be stationed in orbit and therefore in violation of Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. We've also seen that China has, in a variety of ways, disregarded international law in recent years. And here are a few examples. They are a party to the Protocol on Blinding Laser Weapons that basically says that anti-personnel lasers are inherently inhumane, basically a violation of the law of war, and yet they have been using them against Philippine sailors and Australian pilots in the South China Sea and flying above the Arafura Sea just off the coast of northern Australia. They have operated their spy balloons across North American and other countries' airspace in violation of state sovereignty and the right to control our airspace that's recognized in the Chicago Convention on Civil Aviation of 1944. And then, of course, by making these extravagant claims of territorial sovereignty over the South China Sea within the 9-dash line or various features there, even when the Permanent Court of Arbitrations Tribunal has found that their claims are without merit. A lot of these areas actually belong to the Philippines, and that China is legally unsustainable in its claims to territorial seas and exclusive economic zones over a lot of these maritime features. They're a party to it. They've fully ratified this Convention on the Law of the Sea, and yet they are routinely doing things to disregard it, to the point of even using force against Philippine sailors, sometimes causing serious injuries to their eyes, in one case requiring the amputation of a Philippine sailor's thumb after colliding with his boats and stealing some equipment, as you can see in the lower right picture there, from their vessel and hacking holes in the sides of these rigid hull inflatable boats that the Philippines was using to resupply some of their maritime forces down there. And so we've got to keep an eye on China as well. Now, with regard to nuclear weapons actually detonated in space, one possible area that we might have to create more of a division between China and Russia is in China's desire to use space for itself. China has increasingly become more of a space power. And although we recognize they're developing a variety of counter-space weapon systems as well, they are developing more and more space capabilities that could be threatened if any country were to detonate a nuclear weapon in space. And so potentially there could be some avenues for getting them and Russia on different sides of this equation, although that's by no means guaranteed. All right, so now recognizing the threats, recognizing the concerns with violation of international law, well, what can we do about it? What should we do about it? And states have a variety of different options in their toolkit to respond to other countries' unfriendly or unlawful acts. And so we'll go through some of them here. First of all is diplomacy. And this is something that the New York Times article I mentioned really stresses at the end. This should be kind of the leading way. And ideally, in a perfect world, it would be. Countries can talk with each other directly. We can try to enlist our allies in building international support, in multilateral forums such as the UN General Assembly or the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the Security Council itself, the Conference on Disarmament, other international fora to try to build pressure against malign behavior by another state. The Outer Space Treaty in Article 9 provides a direct mechanism, even though it's something that hasn't formally been tried, of Article 9 consultations. This is something that we could potentially invoke to say, hey, this is a potential source of harmful interference. Even if the current Russian Pathfinder satellite isn't actively interfering with something, it shows that they have a desire to do something that could really interfere with the peaceful use of space by all nations. And so consultations would be in order. Treaty withdrawals are another diplomatic option that the US and Russia, for that matter, have used in the past when we have found a particular arms control or other sort of treaty to be no longer within our interests. And whether it is because we realize there are other threats out there that aren't already governed by a treaty, such as China's increased missile and nuclear capabilities that led us in part to withdraw from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, where we recognize the need to enhance our missile defense. Or if it's because of things like Russia's treaty violations through the intermediate range nuclear forces and open skies. Sometimes we say, okay, we're not going to hold ourselves to a one-sided obligation that the other side is not following. And so in accordance with the treaty's own provisions, we'll give notice, we'll withdraw from it. Saudi Arabia did that with the Moon Agreement, effective in January of this year. So treaties are not necessarily permanent, but it's easier to do that when you have a bilateral treaty or a treaty that is much more widely subscribed. Outer Space Treaty is much more multilateral, and some of its provisions may have become customary international law at this point. We certainly would not encourage anybody to withdraw from that. We want to continue to abide by it and uphold it. But I think it's telling that the United States has been trying pretty hard through diplomacy to address this issue. And one of the ways that we did that in April of this year was by bringing a UN Security Council resolution up that would basically call on states parties to the Outer Space Treaty to reaffirm their obligations not to station nuclear weapons in outer space. And basically just remind everybody, hey, we agreed to this, we've got to continue abiding by it. And Russia vetoed that resolution. They claimed it was unnecessary in light of their existing treaty obligations. So they're not disclaiming the Outer Space Treaty, which is good, but yet they're also not admitting to any plans to violate that treaty, which it now seems pretty clear that they are working on. And so that's one of the challenges with misbehavior by a fellow permanent member of the Security Council, that they have this veto pen and the ability to stymie certain types of actions that might impose some consequences on them. So what can you do beyond those basic tools of diplomacy? Well, another category of options in international law is known as retorsion. And this is something that's basically one or more states' lawful response to unfriendly or unlawful behavior. Things that are totally justified for your country. And these can impose some meaningful consequences. Things like limits on diplomatic relations. You can close the embassy. You can expel diplomats who are misbehaving or who are representing a country that's misbehaving. You can impose trade sanctions, embargoes of various kinds, try to enforce secondary sanctions so that they don't have as easy an ability to avoid your initial sanctions by just going through a third country and slapping on a new label to try to launder their trade, but really trying to restrict the technology transfer and economic benefits of trade with the countries. Also, with withdrawals of voluntary aid programs to the extent that those are there. These are all examples of options for retorsion. And we've seen a certain measure of success in that already with the strong, severe sanctions that were imposed on Russia in the wake of the February 22 reinvasion of Ukraine that caused a huge drop in the ruble, huge economic consequences at first. Russia largely bounced back from those for a while, but they have started to take effect again. And if you look at the trends of inflation in Russia, the exchange rate of the ruble relative to the dollar, and the way that they have had to pour so much of their money into military spending just to keep the invasion of Ukraine going, that it's possible those economic means may have a more significant effect over time, but it's still something that is more limited in nature. Another option under international law is the idea of countermeasures. And this is a doctrine that is similar to the idea of self-defense, but for the sub-use of force context. And countermeasures are something that a state may only do in response to another state's prior breach of international law. So we know that there have been some breaches of international law here or that are in the works. And a country that has been harmed by the countermeasure may engage in its own suspension of international legal obligations, but the wrongfulness of the non-performance would be precluded if it is in fact necessary, proportional, directing at getting the originally offending country to stop its original breach of the law, and to the extent possible, it's preferred that it therefore be reversible. Many commentators would also argue that the state undertaking the countermeasure would also have to be notified to the country against whom it's taken. And in many cases, we do that, as you can see from the press release excerpted here, when Russia violated the New START Treaty. Ultimately, after it became clear that they were in breach, the United States officially notified it of some of the countermeasures that we were undertaking. So if Russia was refusing access to our inspectors, then we would in turn deny visas, deny access to their inspectors. If they were failing to make certain reports, we would fail to make the reports that we had committed to on our side until they would resume compliance with the treaty. So again, it's reversible. It's something that is directed at getting them to start complying again. Maybe they haven't done it, but we could turn on our compliance with it at any time that they decide to do the right thing and follow the treaty. However, some countries, including some of our close allies, have argued that the notification requirement is not necessarily required in all cases. And that could include particularly situations in cyberspace, for example, where if you notify the originally offending country of the countermeasure that you're taking, that might enable them to circumvent it. And you certainly don't want that. You want to have a countermeasure that is effective. And so sometimes it may be necessary to do it without notification. As Professor Biller mentioned at the beginning, as you saw on the initial disclaimer slide, I am not purporting to speak on behalf of the United States, just my own personal opinions here. But I think it's reasonable to contend that we should take a similar position and not require notification in absolutely every circumstance if it would undermine the effectiveness of the countermeasure to do so. And so if we're looking at space-based nuclear threats, maybe there could be some countermeasures, again, short of the use of force, but could include some things like intentional interference with satellite signals or cyber operations or things of that nature. Things that would not involve the use of force. I would refer to Article 41 of the UN Charter, in which it says, here are some things that the Security Council may authorize to restore threats to and breaches of the peace that don't involve the use of force. And it mentions complete or partial interruption of radio frequency communications, among other things, which could certainly apply to satellite communications. And so there are a variety of potential options that could exist that might be considered valid countermeasures in response to this. But countermeasures are inherently limited by this desire that they be reversible. And if a country actually gets a nuclear weapon station in orbit and you're limited to only reversible action against it, well, that still potentially leaves them with a nuclear weapon in orbit once you stop conducting the countermeasure. And so that's something that is not really in the interest of any other states to have happen. And so that gets us to kind of the most significant and powerful option in the legal toolkit that states have, which is to potentially use force in self-defense. Now, I don't think any of us want to be in a situation where we are attempting to defend ourselves and the world after a nuclear blast has gone off in outer space, or a fractional orbital nuclear weapon has actually completed more than a fraction of an orbit or less and conducted bombardment of one or more targets on Earth. And so right of self-defense that states have includes a measure of an option for anticipatory or preemptive self-defense. But as with self-defense after you've been attacked, the idea of any kind of anticipatory self-defense must be necessary under the circumstances. It must be proportional to overcome the threat. You've got to try to de-escalate if you can, and make sure that any threat you're responding to is actually imminent. Article 51 of the UN Charter also says that as soon as feasible, you're going to notify the UN Security Council of actions that you're taking in self-defense. So that it's got to be somewhat overt. And if you go back to history, the Caroline case standard from back in, I believe it was 1837, kind of set the early stages of international consensus on this, that if you're going to strike first before an attack that you suspect of being planned is launched against you, the situation has to be instantaneous, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. And this standard was adopted, cited as customary international law in the Nuremberg tribunals after World War II. In rejecting the Nazi argument that they were justified as a matter of preemptive self-defense in some of their invasions of other countries in Europe. And so this idea of anticipatory self-defense is something that I think is very important, but you've got to have some imminence. And so is a Pathfinder satellite without an actual nuclear warhead there an imminent threat? Maybe not. But what if they're getting ready to do one with a potentially armed payload? At what point can you determine that that is actually an imminent threat? At what point would one need to act before it's too late, if one even can act? And how might you go about that? We've seen some precedents for states acting against other states' weapons of mass destruction programs. The three pictures on the right there are all based on different Israeli strikes against the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak that was under construction in 1981. The middle one is before and after images of the Syrian nuclear reactor that was under construction in 2007 until Israel bombed it. And then just earlier this year, Israel conducted strikes against the illegal, undeclared military research facility at Parchin, Iran, that was working on a nuclear weapons program. And we've seen just in the past week in Syria how, as well as in previous instances, the United States previously, sometimes acting in concert with Great Britain and France, and then just this past week, Israel again, have all gone after Syrian chemical weapons of mass destruction facilities as a way of preventing them from either being used by the regime initially or from falling into the hands of terrorists who are becoming the new power in Syria. And so there is certainly historical precedent for preemptive strikes against weapons of mass destruction programs. However, given the countries that we're concerned about here, like Russia, this is obviously a mature nuclear power with a lot of capability, even though they've been weakening and frittering away the lives of their soldiers in Ukraine. They remain a very large and a very capable country in many ways, and possessed of many potentially retaliatory options if any country were to conduct some kind of an attempt at a preemptive strike on their illegal nuclear weapons program for space. And so any preemptive strike, I think one could make the argument that it does present a clear and present danger if they're getting ready to launch or detonate a nuclear weapon in orbit, but then would you incur potentially worse consequences by going after it first? That's something that policymakers are going to have to weigh very seriously, as well as, are there any other ways of off-ramps, of de-escalation, ways that you might achieve your objectives through those lesser means, short of the use of force that we talked about before, and be very sensitive to all of that. And it's also possible that if Russia is developing a capability like this, it's kind of very similar to the so-called doomsday device that we saw in the satirical movie Dr. Strangelove, where it would be something that they might want to have, but not intend to use in an immediate offensive measure, but only if they thought that the regime was being threatened. Might still be ideal to be able to neutralize it without that. But would it be an imminent threat? Under what circumstances do we think they might actually intend to set it off? And could something be done against it without provoking a worse counter reaction? So with that, I hope I've outlined in a way that is helpful to you the variety of tools that states have to respond to illegal or potentially weapons of mass destruction related threats in orbit. Recognizing the law is very clear, but then how you implement your legal rights may be challenging in practice. I think it's very important to develop and use the ways to detect and develop our best observations possible of what our adversaries are up to, and then have some things at hand to potentially be able to reach out and prevent them from being used. With the recognition that although anticipatory self-defense is potentially a legally valid option once we've found a threat to exist and be imminent, it's something that still carries with it the risk of escalation. We've seen successful counter WMD strikes in the past. They haven't resulted in a worse escalation, but Russia is a big power, and we've certainly got to be careful. Same goes for China. So with that, hope I've provoked some questions, and I'm happy to take them if you'd like to chime in on the chat or turn on your audio.
Great. So, hey, Brian, so we're getting close to our hour. Are you okay with sticking around for a little while for some questions?
I am.
Okay, great. But I know some people might have to sign off. So I just want to mention, first off, thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. And also, if you do have to sign off, check out the webinar chat. In there, I've put the links to some upcoming events, to include that symposium in January on nuclear weapons and international law that I discussed. And also we have another space-related webinar coming up next week from the Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Cell. I put the details of that particular webinar in the chat as well. So I just wanted to make sure that folks are aware of those in case they need to sign off. But with that, we'll go ahead and start taking some Q&A. I know that Christian Packard from STARCOM J has had his hand up for a little while. So Christian, I'm going to go ahead and hit the allow to talk button on here, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. You there, Christian?
And Christian, I can't hear you on the chat, but you're welcome to come down to the conference room if you'd like to ask it in person.
Okay, I think maybe I had it wrong. You should be good to go now, Christian. Apologies for that. I think I clicked the wrong button. You there, Christian? All right, while he's working on that, we've got a number of questions here in the Q&A section of the webinar. So I'll go ahead and start going through some of those. From Adrian Times, we have, given the lack of due regard that mainly Russia has been exercising across the board anyway, why are the international treaties still relevant today? In other words, Russia has demonstrated that it will violate and ignore the treaties anyway, so why should anyone else bother to be limited by them? What do you think about that one, Brian?
All right. Well, thanks for the question. And I think this is something we always have to be considering in international law. But in this case, the fact that somebody violates the law doesn't mean that the law is wrong or that everybody should just ignore it in the first place. I think that applies domestically as well as internationally. We know that there are going to be violations, but we still need to have the right rules in place and, to the extent possible, enforce those rules. Obviously, it's more difficult in the international system where you've got all these different sovereign states kind of equally situated with each other compared to what you can do in a domestic environment. But I think it's still important to have the law teach us what right looks like and what we should be doing. And then the fact that a country like Russia may be in violation of international law does provide more options to other states, such as countermeasures, as I've talked about, to be able to go and act against them. So, and then, with something like, violating the treaty by putting a nuclear weapon in space, that's something where reciprocal action of, going up and putting our own nuclear weapon in space, the whole idea of putting a nuclear weapon in space is something that is dangerous and bad for all countries. We showed how bad it is in the early 60s with the detonations up there. We don't want it to happen again. We've agreed that it should not be done by any country, including ourselves. And so it's just completely irresponsible for Russia to be doing that. And then, yeah, looks like Adrian had another question as well.
I would say we've got a question from, well, first let me ask Christian, did you want to ask a question? I'm not sure if we've got that figured out, if you have the ability. I see you unmuting, but I can't hear you. All right. You can also throw your question in the Q&A. We've got one from Victoria Sampson. So she was referencing, as you discussed, the UN Security Council resolution to reaffirm the commitment against deployment of nuclear weapons in outer space. She also mentioned a UN General Assembly effort along the same lines, and asks, do you know of any future steps that are being planned in different multilateral fora to address this potential issue?
Thank you. Yes, I am not privy to any particular plans, but yeah, I definitely acknowledge that. It's great to have the UN General Assembly resolution also affirming this. And I saw the additional comment from Todd Pennington that the Wimmer Manual recognizes Article 4 as a rule of customary international law. Again, Wimmer Manual is not necessarily reflective of state policy, but I think that this is another area where we could potentially move towards reinforcing this obligation as a matter not only of a treaty obligation that's only good for treaty members and for as long as they're party to the treaty, but I think it's an area where the United States or other countries could potentially take the step of affirming this principle to be a matter of customary international law. Now, if you don't get buy-in from Russia or China or other states on that necessarily, don't know that you could assess that customary international law is actually created in that way. But if you have any affirmation from countries that they're obligated to do this thing, even in the absence of a treaty, we did have that UN General Assembly resolution from 1963 that kind of anticipated the rule that we would adopt in the treaty. I think it's an area where it might provide a little more legal heft to that argument.
All right, great. And I might chime in with my own kind of along some of these lines of norms and development of customary international law versus treaty obligations. One of the examples that you gave on the self-defense forum related to the use of the strikes against Syria in 2017 by the US in response to their use of chemical weapons. And a lot of people discussed at the time whether or not there was the development of a new norm or a new set of norms related to the prevention of the use of weapons of mass destruction. And you could point back to those other examples that you had, and also we want to be careful when, making pronouncements on how practice might develop into customary international law. But do you see that kind of evolving norm or potential evolving norm as it relates to preventing states from the illegal use of WMD impacting Russia's deployment of a nuclear weapon into space?
Yeah, I think it's certainly good to have those precedents in place, um, recognizing that it's certainly easier in practice to do them against just emerging weapons of mass destruction possessing states. And even then, we all remember how weapons of mass destruction were part of the justification for overthrowing Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq in 2003. And that turned out to be a more complicated effort than we may have bargained for in the first place. And obviously, Russia's a much more capable country in a variety of ways. And so um, I think that it's useful to have this precedent to say that there's an emerging norm, but then if you also look at some other incidents of Russia's unlawful use of weapons of mass destruction, for example, to assassinate people in the United Kingdom, and on the battlefield in Ukraine, um, I think that we have a more muted response to those incidents than we saw with, say, the Israeli strikes on the various Middle Eastern nuclear reactors.
Fair point. Fair point. And Charles Galbraith has a question. He says, "Do you have a sense for the responses from other countries to Russia's development of a space nuclear weapon, assuming more countries working in concert makes for a more effective diplomatic approach?" And I might add to that something that, as you were making your presentation, I thought about. Traditionally, countermeasures are limited to the affected state, right? You can't utilize third country countermeasures. But in the case of deployment of a nuclear weapon in space, the victim state would seem to me to be potentially all members of the Outer Space Treaty. So do you think that could open up not just for a countries working in concert on diplomatic approaches, but also potentially when it comes to retorsions or countermeasures?
Yeah, and I think we're always stronger internationally when we have a large coalition on our side. If we're able to achieve consensus, the more the merrier. And so I think we've certainly um, seen that play out, excuse me, to a certain degree at the Security Council, despite the veto, and in the UN General Assembly. And Victoria Sampson pointed out in the chat as well that China abstained rather than vetoing or attempting to veto both of those resolutions. So, again, they're kind of trying to stay on the sidelines a little bit, but it's perhaps of some small comfort that at least they didn't join with Russia in vetoing it. Um, Obviously, they're a major player as well, and significant to the development of any customary principles. But yeah, the U.S. Way of operations, certainly since the last century, has been to go in with as many allies and partners as we can, whether that's through NATO or things like the Operation Inherent Resolve Coalition, to really get the most power and the most friends on our side.
Great. Question from Commander Monteperto. Apologies if I butchered that name. He asked, from a purely legal perspective, in light of the findings of last April, is it possible to assume that Russia interprets Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty as a ban on the use of nuclear weapons intended as weapons of mass destruction, feeling free to use tactical nuclear weapons in space?
Well, the Outer Space Treaty bans all stationing of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in outer space. So I don't think the application to nuclear weapons is particularly constrained by the amount of yield that they might be expected to have. They're just inherently weapons of mass destruction, even if they might be claimed to be tactical in nature. So, and it's not just the use, but the stationing there. So I think that's an important caveat. Um, if the limited test ban treaty does seem formulated to just prevent test detonations in orbit or experimental ones, wouldn't necessarily rule things out in wartime, as we saw from the state practice of developing these nuclear ASAP programs for a number of years afterwards. But the the ban on stationing nuclear weapons isn't limited by the amount of yield.
Yeah, and that got me thinking of another question. So this one from an anonymous attendee says that the Outer Space Treaty seems to be hanging on a thread. And Article 4 is one of the important principles given the historical context of the Cold War. If that principle were violated, would it be reasonable to expect that all bets are off and the OST has effectively been abandoned? But that relates to something else that I was thinking about during your discussion, and that relates to, you had the list of all the different treaties that Russia had violated. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Russia historically has been fairly compliant with the Outer Space Treaty, unlike some other treaties that you mentioned. For the most part, they have observed the procedures. So why do you think maybe now they would be looking to violate the OST where traditionally they have been compliant? Or perhaps is this, as this questioner asked, might we be looking at kind of a downward spiral in terms of compliance with the OST?
Yeah, I think it's definitely unfortunate what Russia's been doing lately. They started to get potentially right up to the line with some of the Outer Space Treaty principles, even a few months before this launch of the suspected nuclear Pathfinder satellite, where they destructively tested a direct-sent ASAT missile in November of 2021. And the United States did not claim explicitly that Russia had violated the Outer Space Treaty. Obviously, we've conducted a couple of satellite intercepts ourselves. China and India have done the same. We didn't say it was inherently illegal for them to do it, but the day it happened, the then commander of U.S. Space Command, General James Dickinson, said that Russia exhibited deliberate disregard for the safety, security, and sustainability of space for all nations, echoing language about due regard from Article 9. Not saying explicitly they violated the treaty, but getting really close to it. And in that case, Russia's retort was that they did things in a safe and responsible manner, and they took custody immediately of every piece of debris from that incident and made sure that it deorbited safely. Well, it's forecast by NASA to probably take about 5 years for all the debris from that to come down. And there had to be emergency shelter-in-place actions or shelter on the Soyuz capsules for the cosmonauts on the International Space Station, and then for the other members on their own respective crew capsules. So there was definitely an increased acute risk to the space station. Fortunately, didn't result in any injury, but I think Russia should have consulted beforehand and didn't under that case. But and the United States didn't explicitly say they were required to, but I think in the event of a subsequent event that shows a lack of due regard or shows a situation where consultations should be required, maybe that could be kind of the next step in our escalation of our response to it, to say, okay, we think they've crossed a line and now they have actually violated the Outer Space Treaty.
Fair enough. Kevin McConnell asks, when we look at legal responses as falling into the 4 categories that you mentioned, diplomacy, rhetorical, countermeasure, self-defense, does or should the Russian perspective of conflict and competition existing on a continuous scale factor into where a state draws the line between countermeasures and self-defense?
Yeah, so obviously it's important to assess how they will react and not to mirror our understanding of the law and of the consequences of a certain act, and just assume that they're going to see things the same way we are. I think we need to try to understand them as best we can and recognize that we may do things that we consider perfectly lawful that they object to and want to retaliate against in some fashion, like the example I gave of the taking off the limits to some degree, at least, of the long distance weapons that can be used to target sites in Russia, and the way that Russia then fired off their Oreshnik test missile at Ukraine as an alleged response to that. So I think we need to assess how they're going to respond and take it into account, but still certainly do things that are consistent with our own understanding of the law.
Okay. Mark Meyer asks a very good question. How can we build more trust to get back to cooperation in space safety? I think that's something that we all have concerns about.
Yeah, great question as well. And something that the United States has tried in a lot of ways to lean forward in transparency and communication. It's part of our DoD space policy that we're going to communicate and make notifications about what we're doing in space to the extent possible. And so it's something that we certainly do through our tracking and space situational awareness sharing agreements. Being able to notify other countries of potential conjunctions in orbit, and really doing the revelations, the name and shame where appropriate about malign activities being conducted by other countries, so that people are on notice and can understand what threats are out there and how best to avoid them, whether those are natural or man-made issues.
Adrian Times had another question that relates to private satellites. Obviously, we've seen an explosion of private satellites in space. And if Russia were to deploy a nuclear weapon or any weapon for that matter in space that affected these private US satellites, he asked, is there a declared policy that in the event of hostile foreign action in space against commercial or non-government assets, would they be defended? If there is if so, is there any policy about private US satellite owners adding hardware to their satellites to defend them from such an eventuality?
A lot of interesting issues here. Certainly, the U.S. National Space Policy has some language about regarding any purposeful interference with U.S. space assets as an infringement on our national rights and kind of reserving the right to respond in a time, place, and manner and domain of our choosing. So we kind of leave it vague, but leave the option open that we can, in fact, respond against that. Under the Outer Space Treaty, we are responsible for our national activities in outer space, to include those conducted by private entities. And we are also responsible to authorize and supervise private space activities. So when private space companies are threatened or potentially thinking about wanting to defend themselves, a lot of interesting issues there. Any kinds of defensive capabilities put aboard a space object would presumably have to be disclosed and analyzed in any kind of launch licensing application or remote sensing license application, other types of regulatory approvals that the United States would have to grant before something could be done. And when it comes to defense of private space assets, I think it's something that's an option. It's not necessarily going to be necessary in every case, but I think you would want to look at what the national security nexus is of the capability that is under threat, and what the effect on the United States would be, what the effect of something bad happening to us or of a strong reaction to it would be in terms of setting a precedent for what happens. I mean, obviously we saw a lot of non-kinetic action, but actions that had some permanent effects that Russia committed against Viasat and Starlink satellite networks in the run-up to its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, including cyber intrusions that actually disabled hundreds of Viasat terminals on the Earth and all over Europe to try to prevent Ukraine from using that service. They've been less successful against Starlink. Obviously, if they were to detonate a nuclear weapon in orbit, that could potentially even take out a resilient distributed constellation like Starlink. But we certainly hope to keep them from getting to that point, and we've been working within the Department of Defense for many years now. I think there was an Air Force Space Command white paper back in 2012 or thereabouts that was talking about the need to obtain resiliency through proliferation of widely distributed satellite constellations. And we've been doing that both within DoD through our proliferated warfighter space architecture that the Space Development Agency is putting together, as well as through private entities like with Starlink. And trying to maintain resiliency through proliferation. But and in a case like that, if somebody's talking about plinking a single satellite with kinetic intercept, say, there's certainly debris cascade concerns. But if you have a proliferated constellation, maybe you can take that. Maybe the private company can absorb that. But if you're talking about threatening them with a nuclear blast, then that would be of much greater danger to all, and would probably justify more serious means against it.
Great. Well, hey, we're already 20 minutes over. I think we at least partially responded to all the remaining questions. If not, I sincerely apologize. But I do want to be respectful of Major Green's time. So we're going to go ahead and end it at this point. But I want to, again, reiterate my thanks to Major Green for that outstanding presentation. It was very professional, very informative. I really enjoyed it. I hope everybody else did as well. A reminder of our upcoming events again, check the chat on there for those and for links. Also, just so you know, if you want to go back and watch any of our previous webinars, they are available on our YouTube site. So just go to YouTube and put in Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Cell. We have series on cyber, emerging technology, space, nuclear weapons, on a number of different topics. And look out upcoming in the future for those of you who are Articles of War fans. The website out of the Lieber Center at West Point will be in the future hanging links to our webinars and other products from USAFA here on the Articles of War website to try and get some crosstalk and collaboration going. So look for that in the future as well. Again, thanks, Brian. Thanks for everybody for attending. I really enjoyed it. And I'll turn it over to you if you have any final comments, Major Green.
Thanks, Professor Biller, and to all who attended and submitted questions or comments. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this issue and really get these very important issues on the table as we're facing this increased threat environment. So thank you so much for your time.
Agree wholeheartedly. We'll see you all next time, everyone. Thank you.